Welcome to Biology Module 15, Part 1. Now with a stylus pen. Hey, with stylus. Now you don't have to try to read the whiteboard stuff I write on there. So, if you have any questions about this module or anything else, you can always give me an email at mrc@mrcscience.com. Okay, for all of these videos, you should have your books handy. If you don't have your book, go ahead and pause the video, go grab it. Okay, so we're moving into botany. We did a little bit last week, and now we're going to do some more. We're going to get into the physiology of plants, or how they're set up. So, we're going to talk about some of the functions that work with the plants now. Delete that. Okay, couple processes. The main thing plants depend upon is water. Water is required for a number of their processes. Water is required for photosynthesis. Water is required for trigger pressure, hydrolysis, and transport. We're going to talk about all of those today. So let's start out with the most obvious one you're kind of familiar with already, photosynthesis. You're familiar with, oops, get my pen. Photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water gives us glucose plus oxygen. So required. So water is required for photosynthesis. This is not the largest use of water in the plants. One use, so this is a photosynthesis. One use you're relatively familiar already is trigger pressure. Going back, oops. Control Z is your friend. Trigger pressure. Okay. Going back, trigger pressure inside of these cells, plant cells are kind of rectangular in shape. Inside is a large central vacuole. You remember that large central vacuole stores water, not only for the plant to use, but to provide pressure against the outsides of the cell, so that it can push against the cell wall, which is on the outside, and keep the plant rigid. If that dries up, the cell begins to flex and bend under its own weight. Or under the weight of the plant, and thus it causes wilting. So without trigger pressure, you get wilting. Now trigger pressure is used in other areas as well. That one you're familiar with. Trigger pressure is used in what's called nastic motion. Plants can move. Some you're familiar with already. Plants will move towards sunlight. Oops. Sunlight is called phototropism. So plants will adjust their leaves to face the sun to get the most sun to carry out photosynthesis. Nastic movement Nastic movement is a plant's response to stimulus such that the direction of the response is pre-programmed and not dependent upon the stimulus. So phototropism depends on the direction of the sun. If the plant faces its leaves towards the sun, that's the stimulus is the sunlight. The response or the movement, phototropism, is towards the sun. Nastic movement is a response that the direction of response isn't dependent upon the stimulus. They give you a few examples here. Crocus flower, for example, opens at a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the crocus flower will open. Generally, how plants move is you've got a stem or such with a bunch of cells in it. Your cells are all kind of brick cells. So what happens for movement is trigger pressure increases on one side and decreases on the other side, causing a bend or a movement. We'll talk a little bit about the hormones involved in this and stuff in a little bit. Tropism is that movement. Nastic movement isn't dependent upon that. So with the crocus flower at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the flowers will open. Okay. The next. There's other nastic movements like that. You might be familiar with the Venus flytrap. Its response to stimulus inside causes the flytrap to close, trapping the insects. So, okay. Next one is hydrolysis. Now you can remember back from cell biology, lysis or lys means to break, right? So hydro means water. So basically hydrolysis is using water to break stuff. What it's generally breaking in plants is starches. Plants store sugars that they're not using right now. That's a really bad drawing. So plants store sugar as starch. What happens is they make long chains of sugar. Remember your glucose and your sucrose and your fructose are all short chain sugars. They put together, they get starches. Well, eventually your plants want some of that starch as food, especially as food supply breaks down during the night or longer, less sunny days, or during the winter if it needs some food. It will break down that starch back into some sugars. How it does that, it uses water to lyse the starch into glucose so that it can be brought back into the cell, and that's a really bad drawing. Okay, so that's hydrolysis, so starch. Okay, let's get rid of that. Delete. Okay, so we said the four were photosynthesis, trigger pressure, hydrolysis. The last one is transport. Transport is kind of interesting in plants. Oops. Grab. Transport. Okay. Now transports, remember you've got a vascular system in plants. Let's draw our plant here. Whoop. Here's a leaf. At the top of the plant. At the bottom of the plant you got the roots. And in there you got your vascular tissue. Now, sugars dissolve in water. Water is good for transporting. Sugar is made. So in the leaf, you make sugar using photosynthesis. The water helps transport that down into other areas of the plants for use. The main thing we care about now that's useful, the main thing we care about is plants are in the ground, out of the ground to get some water and gets nutrients that travel up the plant. So how does it go up? Plants don't have a heart. They don't have a pump to pump. So what happens is, if we remember our cross section of our leaf, we had our top epidermis, we had our palisade cells, we had our palisade mesophyll, we had our spongy mesophyll, and then we had our bottom layer with pores called stomata, surrounded by guard cells. So what happens is air, or specifically carbon dioxide, goes into the cell for use with into the leaf for use with photosynthesis. Out of there comes not only our oxygen we breathe, but also water vapor through evaporation. Anyone remember what we call evaporation in plants? It's called transpiration. So water evaporates from plants. Now what's interesting about water is cohesive. That means it sticks to itself. If you put a drop of water on the table, you notice it doesn't flatten out nice and flat. It's a bubble because water has surface tension. It clings to itself through hydrogen bonding. So what happens is water exits out of this the leaf. That cohesion drags more water. Drags water up the leaf, out of the petiole stem, works the water up the root and out of the ground. So all that cohesion kind of causes pressure or a drag, which drags everything up into the plant. That's why xylem can flow up, because of that cohesion of water. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's not completely understood, but that's the main way that it travels. So, okay, so they talk a little bit about water absorptions in plants. Most plants have their root system in the soil, so you're familiar with the soil. And in the soil you have many things. You have gravel, sand, silt, and clay. Gravel, sand, and sand create pores that can store water or hold it. It's kind of interesting if you think of the greenest place you run across in a lot of places. That would be a golf course. Now, the interesting thing about golf courses is the soil underneath has been changed. It's very sandy. Why it's very sandy is because there's lots of pores can hold lots of water. So they can have nice green grass. The problem with sandy soil is it drains out and it dries out quickly, so they need to water all the time to keep that. But those create pore spaces in there. In here also is loam. Loam is a mixture of gravel, or it's a mixture of organic material with the soil. Added organic material. Really getting bad. Hey, this is kind of like when I write on the whiteboard. That organic material has some of the things the plants need, especially things like nitrogen from breaking down, things like that. So, but yeah, it works on cohesion. Kind of an interesting picture. If you turn to page 467, you see a picture of a water strider, they call it. It's a little insect that can stand on the water. The reason it can stand on the water is because its weight is not sufficient to break that surface tension. So it won't sink easily into the water, and it can actually walk on the water. Okay. So we got tensin. They talk a little bit about something called translocation, the process by which organic substances move through the phloem of the plant. Now we talked about the xylem going up, the phloem flows down, and that those organic substances move down as well, the primary one being glucose, which is then converted, stored as starch in other places. Okay. So xylem are simply tubes through which water flows. The cells they need not be alive. But the phloem cells need to be alive. They actively expend energy to guide the flow of organic molecules throughout the plant. So there is some active guidance, usually controlled through hormones. Hormones. Now we know that animals, and we have hormones. Hormones are basically chemical messengers. In us, we have our nervous system sends a lot of messages, but our glands, especially some of our main controlling glands like the pituitary, hypothalamus, things like that, send out chemical messengers to control parts of the body as well. So these hormones, circulate through the organism to interact with specifically targeted cells and call that. Okay, on page 469 are a list of some of the hormones that you will need to know. Auxins deal with elongation, so they work with tropisms, phototropism, gravitropism, tropism, stigmatropism, lots of different tropisms you'll read about. Stigma is the response to touch. Example of that is vines, how they'll send little runners to wrap around things to cling to so they can continue to go up. Auxins deal with extending elongating plants. So let's see. So then different movements. I can't even say this one. Etylation. There we go on page 470. Etylation, an extreme form of phototropism. This is rare. If you take a plant that normally grows in the dark or in the light and responds with some kind of tropism and you put it completely in the dark, sometimes the auxins will kind of go crazy and it will grow rapidly and make very long and thin what's the word I'm looking for? Well, stems or whatever. The reason for this is it's trying to quickly get to the sun. It says, well, we can't survive without the sun, so it will do that. Okay. So then part of the tropisms, I mentioned it before, on page 472 is a nice picture of the Venus flytrap. Venus flytrap is insectivorous, which is actually kind of, in a way, incorrect for this. Insectivorous, what do you think that means? Well, for omnivorous, we eat many things. Carnivorous, we eat meat. Insectivorous eats insects, and I can't spell. Now, in reality, these plants do not eat insects. In reality, they are green. They practice phototropism, or photosynthesis for their food. But a plant does not live on glucose alone, sugar alone, just like you. It needs other things. Generally, it has its roots in the soil to gather other organic materials needed via that loam. These plants were designed, it almost appears, to live in areas where these necessary ingredients are are missing from the soil. So what it does is it captures the insects, it holds it until it dies, and then it drops it to the ground where it degrades and adds the needed organic material into the soil so that it can continue. Okay, we are getting into reproduction in plants. I'm going to check and see where we're supposed to be up to. Sexual reproduction and Amphitrite. So let's talk a little bit about vegetative reproduction. So let's grab this, delete. So we got, in plants, we got sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, we're going to get into that in much more detail in our next video. But now we have a form of asexual reproduction that most, if not all, plants can carry out. This is called vegetative. Basically, what vegetative reproduction is you take a piece of the plant. Say you take a stem with a leaf on it. There we go. Ooh, look at how pretty that is. It's missing the petiole and the other part. So you take a piece like that, you cut it off, and you drop it in a bowl of water. Now, if you suspend it there, what you'll notice is the meristematic tissue around the edges, the part of the tissue that's growing, effectively undifferentiated, responses because of what's going on, the lack of roots, things like that, the hormones will trigger it to start growing roots. And then those roots it can be planted in the soil, or maybe sometimes you stick it right in the soil and it will start growing roots and vegetatively recreate that. So you can take a clipping from a plant. So if we got a plant here, say we got a nice little flower. And we got some stems with branches, with leaves. Now if we take one of those, and we plant that leaf in the soil, sometimes it will grow into another little plant. Conditions have to be right. It has to be able to survive without the piece that it's missing long enough to handle it. So, example of vegetative reproduction. Anyone ever grown strawberries? On page 474, you will see strawberries send out runners. They'll often do this. They'll send out a runner. When the runner kind of embeds in the soil again, it will grow a new plant with roots and leaves and berries. So that's a way they talk about how this can be useful to commercial gardeners, like your greenhouses. Say they've got, say they've got a flower that they really like, it comes out just perfect, they want many of those. Well, if we do asexual reproduction, if we take clippings of that flower and grow new plants, those flowers are going to be genetically identical to the original. So you have a much better chance to get the exact same flowers again. Why don't you have a 100% chance? Well, other things come in, environmental practices come into play. Things like that can also affect the growth of the flower, but that's a good way. Another thing they talk about is grafting. Taking part of one plant and fixing it into the other plant to help it grow. So you could get a tree that produces two types of fruit if they are genetically viable enough that you can graft a different fruit on there. So you'll read more about that, but so we've gotten as far as we need to go today. We're going to move on with the rest of it next week. Again, if you have any questions, email me at mrc@mrcscience.com. Thanks.